Excellencies, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to address the Korean Global Forum for Peace, which has, since 2010, provided an important space to discuss peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. At the end of my term as High Commissioner for Human Rights, it is truly fitting to be able to talk about some of the most critical issues for the people of the Korean Peninsula. Experiences from the peninsula and the future course it may take hold important lessons during this time of global turbulence. The Korean War between 1950 and 1953 produced an immeasurable level of human suffering and left the peninsula divided. It came only 5 years after the emblematic words of the United Nations Charter were agreed upon, expressing the will of the international community, and I will quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, end of quote. After 2 world wars in the space of 30 years, the drafters of the United Nations Charter realized that respect for human rights formed the very foundation for peace and stability between states. Koreans of both sides of the 38th parallel continue to live with the consequences of the failure to heed these words, with peace and security on the peninsula remaining elusive. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, where over 40% of people endure chronic food insecurity, and in the context of long-standing human rights violations, the voice of the people have not been allowed to shape public policy and ensure that state power and resources serve their needs and aspirations. In interstate relations, it also remains imperative to heed the words of the UN Charter and place human rights at the center of efforts to secure peace and stability. The past year has been escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula and in the wider region, with many countries recording record levels of military spending. As a former Minister of Defense myself, I understand the role of the military in protecting peace and stability, but I also know how important it is that military strength is balanced with international cooperation, which prioritizes meeting the basic needs and protecting the human rights of the people. Integrating human rights into interstate diplomacy requires sustained engagement with states on the fulfillment of their international obligations. My office has been making efforts to open dialogue with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on the implementation of recommendations from the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism. Any meaningful progress can only be achieved if this forms part of a wider coordinated effort from the international community to create opportunities for constructive engagement on human rights with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The imperative of interstate cooperation of human rights comes into ever sharper focus as the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic emerges. This includes interstate cooperation on vaccine provision and alleviating food shortages. However, as highlighted recently by the former Special Rapporteur on DPRK, Thomas Ojea Quintana, the country is currently more isolated from the international community than ever before. This isolation cannot be left to harden. Such isolation has wider implications for human rights. Without communication, there can be no trust between states. This increases the risk of miscalculation and the likelihood of military conflict, with only dire consequences for human rights, including the right to life. As a first step, we need to secure the return of United Nations and diplomatic staff to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with the freedom of movement needed to carry out their mandates. From here, we can begin to build towards a more comprehensive form of engagement with a country that is driven by the needs of the North Korean people. I hope that this year's conference will help grapple with these issues and help to create an inspiring and inclusive vision that joins the dots between human rights, peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and the wider region. I thank you for your attention.